The padlock clicked open in my hand, and I knew, standing there in the July heat with rust flaking onto my fingers, that I was about to betray my father's last wish. He'd been dead 3 months. My mother had been remarried for 6 weeks. I'm Cassie, 32 years old, never married, working as a junior accountant at a firm where I'm perpetually overlooked. I still live 20 minutes from the house I grew up in, still drive past my childhood elementary school on my way to buy groceries. My life has always been small, contained. My father used to say I had a gift for noticing things other people missed. He meant it as a compliment. I wore it like an apology. The warehouse sat at the edge of an industrial park Dad had invested in decades ago, back when this part of town still had potential. He'd never told me what he kept here. Never told my mother either, as far as I knew. But he'd pressed the key into my palm 2 weeks before the cancer took him, his hand weightless as paper, and said, "Not yet. You'll know when." I hadn't known when. I still didn't. But Marc, my mother's new husband, a man who'd appeared at her book club 9 months ago with expensive shoes and a practiced smile, had asked about the warehouse at dinner last Tuesday. Asked like he already knew it existed. Asked like he'd been looking. The door scraped open. Heat poured out, thick and stale. Inside, the space was smaller than I'd imagined, maybe 20 by 30 feet, crowded with metal shelving units and wooden crates stacked in careful rows. Everything labeled in my father's cramped handwriting. Dates. Numbers. Abbreviations I didn't recognize. I moved between the shelves slowly, reading labels, touching nothing. My father had been a careful man. Precise. He'd worked in procurement for a defense contractor, the kind of job that sounded boring at dinner parties, the kind that required security clearance and silence. He'd been good at silence. I found the first photograph tucked inside a manila folder marked 1998 to 2001. Not hidden, exactly. Just filed. A photo of a man I didn't recognize standing beside a younger version of my father, both of them in front of a cargo truck. The back of the photo had a date and a single word, verified. Then another folder. More photos. Shipping manifests. Receipts printed on paper so old it had gone yellow at the edges. Everything organized, catalogued, preserved. My father documenting something, building a record of something, for 25 years. I sat down on a wooden crate, the heat pressing against my skin, and began to read. By the time I understood what I was looking at, the sun had shifted. The warehouse had grown dim. My phone showed 4 missed calls from my mother. I didn't call back. I sat there with a folder open across my lap, my father's careful handwriting swimming in front of my eyes, and felt the weight of what he'd left me. He'd been a witness. Not a participant, the records made that clear, but a witness. Someone who'd seen things moving through his company that shouldn't have moved. Equipment disappearing from manifests. Shipments rerouted. Money changing hands in ways that left no official trail. He'd documented it all. Quietly. Precisely. For decades. And he'd never reported it. Never turned it in. Just watched, recorded, and filed everything away in this tin box at the edge of town. I didn't know why. The records didn't say. Maybe he'd been afraid. Maybe he'd been waiting for the right moment. Maybe he'd been protecting someone. My mother, me, himself. The folders didn't contain his reasoning, only his evidence. What they did contain, in the back of the last file drawer, was a letter addressed to me. I recognized his handwriting before I'd fully pulled the envelope free. My name in his careful script. No date. I opened it there in the dying light, my hand steadier than I'd expected. Cassie, it began. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've decided it's time. I won't tell you what to do with what's here. You're smarter than I ever gave you credit for, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a lot of things. What's in this warehouse is a choice I made, to document but not act, to preserve but not expose. I told myself I was protecting our family. Maybe I was just protecting myself. Marc isn't who he says he is. The sentence sat alone on the page, separated from the rest by a full line of white space. He came to my office last year. Said he was a consultant, asked questions about old contracts, old shipments. I didn't think much of it then. By the time I understood what he was looking for, he'd already gotten close to your mother. I don't know if he loves her. I don't know if he's capable of it. What I know is that he's looking for this. For proof of what happened, or proof of what didn't happen. For leverage, maybe. For money, probably. I should have told you sooner. I should have told her. But I was weak, and I was dying, and I wanted to believe I'd kept you both safe by saying nothing. You'll have to decide now. What to do with all of this. What to tell her. Whether to let him find what he's looking for. I trust you, Cassie. I always have. I'm sorry I never said it out loud. The letter wasn't signed. It just stopped, the way his voice had stopped, mid-thought, unfinished. I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then I stood, turned off the single bare bulb that had been burning above me, and locked the warehouse behind me. The padlock clicked shut with the same sound it had made opening. I drove home in silence, the letter in my passenger seat, my mind turning over the same questions again and again. What had Marc told my mother about how they met? What had she told me? I tried to remember, but the details blurred together. Book club. A friend of a friend. He'd seemed kind. He'd seemed interested in her life, in her stories about my father. Of course he had. I parked outside my apartment and sat in the car until the summer heat became unbearable. Then I went inside, made tea I didn't drink, and pulled out my laptop. If Marc wasn't who he said he was, there would be traces. Inconsistencies. Gaps. I'd spent years as an accountant learning to find the places where numbers didn't quite line up, where stories had been smoothed over, where someone had tried to make things look cleaner than they were. I started with the easy things. Public records. Social media. Background checks you could run online for $30. I worked through the night, cross-referencing, noting discrepancies, building my own careful document of who Marc claimed to be versus who he actually was. By morning, I had enough to know my father had been right. Marc's employment history had gaps. Years where he'd claimed to work for companies that had no record of him, positions that didn't quite match the timeline he'd given my mother. His college degree came from a school that had closed in the 90s. The consulting firm he said he'd retired from had dissolved 8 months before he'd met my mother. Buried in debt and legal trouble, I had to dig through 3 layers of LLC restructuring to find. He was a fabrication. A careful one, built for a specific purpose, but a fabrication nonetheless. And my mother, 63 years old, widowed and lonely and so desperate to believe someone could love her again, had welcomed him into her home, her bed, her bank accounts. I closed my laptop as the sun came up. Made coffee. Showered. Dressed for work like it was any other Thursday. I didn't call my mother. Not yet. I didn't know what I'd say. Didn't know if she'd believe me. Didn't know if showing her the truth would save her or shatter her. What I knew was this. Marc was looking for my father's records. And when he didn't find them where he expected, he'd start looking harder. He'd start asking more questions. He'd start pressuring my mother, or pressuring me, or both. The warehouse was safe for now. But for now wasn't forever. I needed a plan. Not a loud one. I wasn't built for confrontation, never had been. But a careful one. The kind my father would have made, if he'd had more time. I thought about the letter. About my father's apology for never saying out loud that he trusted me. I was going to have to earn that trust now. And I was going to have to do it quietly, the way he'd taught me. By noticing what other people missed. By documenting what needed to be preserved. By waiting for exactly the right moment. Marc had come looking for leverage. I was going to make sure he found something else entirely. The first thing I did was nothing. For 2 weeks, I went to work, filed reports, sat through meetings where my suggestions were talked over by men who'd been hired after me. I had dinner with my mother and Marc on Sunday like we'd planned, watched him charm her in their kitchen, watched him ask casual questions about Dad's old papers, his storage units, whether there was anything Mom still needed to sort through. I watched her tell him no, everything important was at the house, she'd gone through it all. I watched him not believe her. He was good. I'll give him that. The way he touched her shoulder when he passed behind her chair. The way he laughed at her stories. The way he made her feel seen. My mother glowed under his attention like a plant finally getting enough light. It made my chest ache. It made me furious. I smiled. Ate the pasta he'd made. Complimented his cooking. When he asked me about work, I gave him the same bland summary I'd given a dozen times before. Fine, busy, nothing exciting. When he asked if I'd been going through any of Dad's old things, any files or boxes he might have left with me, I said no. Said I'd been too busy. Said maybe someday. He smiled like he believed me. I smiled like I believed him believing me. The performance exhausted me. I drove home that night with my hands tight on the wheel, anger sitting hot and solid in my throat. But I didn't act on it. Not yet. My father had documented for 25 years before making a single move. I could wait 2 weeks. What I did during those 2 weeks was learn everything I could about the records in the warehouse. I went back 3 times, always in the evening, always alone. I photographed every document. Scanned every page. Uploaded everything to an encrypted cloud account and a physical hard drive I kept in my desk drawer at work. I organized the files the way my father had organized them, chronologically, methodically, with annotations. The picture that emerged was bigger than I'd initially understood. The discrepancies my father had tracked weren't just about missing equipment or rerouted shipments. They were about contracts awarded to shell companies. About military technology that had been purchased, documented, and then disappeared from official records. About money, millions of dollars, moving through accounts that shouldn't have existed. My father's company had been a node in a network. Not the center, but close enough to see the whole web. And he'd mapped it, piece by piece, transaction by transaction, for a quarter of a century. I didn't understand all of it. The technical specifications went over my head. The corporate structures were labyrinthine. But I understood enough to know that what my father had documented could destroy careers, end contracts, trigger investigations. Could put people in prison. Could get people killed. That thought came to me on my 3rd visit to the warehouse, sitting on the same wooden crate, reading a memo about a shipment that had been diverted to a country under arms embargo. I'd been thinking about leverage, about evidence, about what Marc wanted and how to keep it from him. I hadn't been thinking about danger. About the fact that my father might have stayed silent not just out of fear for himself, but out of fear for us. I sat very still, the memo in my hand, and reconsidered everything. If Marc was looking for these records, he wasn't working alone. He couldn't be. This was too big, too complex, too carefully structured for one man running a con on a widow. He was working for someone. Reporting to someone. Someone who knew what my father had known, who'd tracked him to this warehouse, who'd sent Marc to find the proof and retrieve it. Or destroy it. My hands started shaking. I put the memo down carefully, locked the warehouse, drove home. Sat in my apartment with all the lights off and tried to think. I could go to the police. The FBI, maybe. Turn everything over, let someone else handle it. Protect my mother by exposing Marc, exposing everything. But I didn't know who was implicated in what my father had documented. Didn't know how far the network extended. Didn't know if the people I'd be turning the evidence over to were the same people who'd created the problems in the first place. My father had known all this. Had lived with it for decades. Had died without resolving it, leaving the choice to me. I thought about his letter. You're smarter than I ever gave you credit for. I'd spent my whole life being underestimated. By my father, by my colleagues, by men like Marc who looked at me and saw someone small and forgettable. Someone who wouldn't notice. Someone who wouldn't matter. For the first time, I considered using that. The idea came slowly, carefully, the way good ideas do. Not a flash of inspiration, but a gradual recognition of what was already there, waiting to be assembled. Marc thought I was irrelevant. He'd barely looked at me during that Sunday dinner, his attention always on my mother, his questions casual enough to seem like polite conversation. He didn't see me as a threat. Didn't see me as anything. Which meant he wouldn't see me coming. I started making my own documentation. Not of what was in the warehouse, I already had that. But of Marc. His routines, his habits, his patterns. When he left the house my mother now shared with him. Where he went. Who he met. I called in sick to work on a Wednesday and followed him. Kept 3 cars back, the way they do in movies, feeling ridiculous and terrified and grimly focused. He drove to a coffee shop in a part of town he'd told my mother he never went to. Met a man in an expensive suit. Talked for 40 minutes. Left without the manila envelope he'd brought, which the man in the suit tucked into a briefcase. I took photos from my car. Zoomed in enough to get faces, license plates, timestamps. Added them to my growing file. The following week, I did it again. Different day, different location. Same pattern. Marc meeting people my mother didn't know about, conversations that looked too intense to be casual, exchanges that looked too deliberate to be innocent. I was building my own web now. Mapping Marc the way my father had mapped the network. Finding the gaps between what he claimed and what he actually did. It was tedious work. Patient work. The kind of work I'd been trained for, even if I'd been trained in spreadsheets instead of surveillance. And slowly, across those weeks of watching and waiting and documenting, something shifted inside me. The fear didn't go away. But it settled. Made room for something else. Something colder and more calculated. Marc had come into our lives looking for leverage. For proof. For whatever he'd been sent to find. I was going to give it to him. Not the real records. Not my father's careful documentation. But something close enough to convince him he'd found what he was looking for. Something that would draw him out, make him careless, force him to show his hand. I spent a weekend building the fake. Used some of my father's real documents as templates, changed names and dates and details just enough. Made it look like my father had been documenting a different scheme, something adjacent to the truth but not quite accurate. Something that would send Marc and whoever he worked for looking in the wrong direction. The forgery had to be good enough to be believed but wrong enough to be useless. It had to look like something my father would have hidden. Something worth finding. I worked on it the way I worked on everything, carefully, precisely, checking every detail. When I was done, I had a folder that looked decades old, filled with documents that looked authentic, telling a story that was almost true. I put it in the warehouse. Not prominently, but not hidden either. In a file cabinet my father had left partially open, in a drawer that would be easy to find if someone was looking. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, my mother called. Her voice was strange, tight, like she was trying to sound normal and failing. Marc had asked her again about my father's storage. Had mentioned the warehouse specifically. Had said he'd been thinking about the industrial park, about whether the property might be worth something, whether she'd considered selling it. She wanted to know if I had the key. I told her yes. Told her I'd been meaning to go through it, see what was there. Told her I'd do it this weekend, if she wanted. Bring her anything that seemed important. She said that would be good. Said Marc was just trying to help, trying to make sure she wasn't holding on to property that was costing her money for no reason. She said it like she believed it. Like she needed to believe it. I told her I understood. Told her I'd take care of it. When I hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand and felt the last piece of my plan click into place. Marc would push now. Would find a way to get to the warehouse himself, or convince my mother to let him help, or follow me there. He'd been patient for months, but patience had limits. If he thought the records were there, accessible, waiting to be found, he'd move. And when he did, I'd be ready. I thought about my father's letter again. About his apology for staying silent. About his trust in me to make the choice he couldn't make. I wasn't going to stay silent. But I wasn't going to expose everything either. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly who Marc was working for, what they wanted, and how far they were willing to go to get it. I was going to make them show me. And I was going to document every second of it, the way my father had taught me. The way they'd never expect someone like me to do. Marc came to the warehouse on Saturday morning. I wasn't there. I was 3 blocks away, parked behind an abandoned mechanic shop, watching the feed from the camera I'd installed inside the warehouse 2 days earlier. It was small, battery-powered, tucked into the corner of a high shelf where it had a clear view of the filing cabinets. The kind of thing you could buy online for $70. The kind of thing no one would think to look for. He didn't break in. He had a key. I watched him unlock the door like he'd done it 100 times, and maybe he had. Maybe he'd been coming here for months, searching while I'd been at work, while my mother thought he was at the gym or running errands or any of the other small lies he'd been feeding her. The thought made my jaw tight. He moved through the space efficiently. Not rushed, but purposeful. He knew what he was looking for. Started with the filing cabinets, going through drawers in order, checking labels, pulling folders. He was careful, I noticed. Put things back where he'd found them. Didn't leave obvious signs of disturbance. Professional. Practiced. It took him 11 minutes to find the fake documents I'd planted. I watched him pause, watched him pull the folder out slowly, watched him open it and start reading. Even through the camera's grainy feed, I could see the shift in his posture. The tension in his shoulders releasing. The small nod, like he was confirming something he'd already suspected. He took photos of every page. Didn't remove the originals. Just documented them with his phone, methodical and quick, then put the folder back exactly where he'd found it. Then he left. Locked the door behind him. Walked to his car like nothing had happened. I sat in my car for a long time after he'd driven away, watching the empty feed from the warehouse, my heart beating slow and steady in my chest. He'd taken the bait. Now I needed to see what he'd do with it. That night, my mother called to ask if I'd made it to the warehouse. I told her yes, that there wasn't much there, some old files, equipment, nothing valuable. I'd keep looking, I said, but it might be worth selling the property like Marc suggested. She sounded relieved. Said Marc would be happy to hear it. He'd been worried about her holding on to things that just cost money. I said that was thoughtful of him. The lie tasted like copper in my mouth. Over the next week, I tracked Marc's movements more carefully. He met with the man in the expensive suit again, this time at a hotel bar downtown. Their conversation lasted an hour. The man looked pleased. Marc looked tense. I took more photos. Logged times, locations, license plates. Built a timeline of every meeting, every call Marc took while standing outside my mother's house, every moment when his careful mask slipped and something colder showed through. And I waited for him to make his next move. It came 10 days after he'd been to the warehouse. My mother invited me to dinner on a Wednesday. Said Marc wanted to talk to me about something, nothing bad, just something he'd been thinking about. Her voice had that careful lightness that meant she was nervous. I knew what it would be before I arrived. Marc had made salmon, opened wine, set the table like we were celebrating something. My mother smiled too much. Marc smiled just enough. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap and waited. He started with small talk. Asked about work. I gave him the same nothing answers I always did. He nodded, attentive, then glanced at my mother like he was asking permission for something. She nodded back. Marc leaned forward slightly. His voice was warm, concerned. He'd been thinking about my father's warehouse, he said. About the property. He'd done some research, talked to some people he knew in real estate. The industrial park was being rezoned. Property values were going up. If we sold now, my mother could make a significant amount of money. I waited. He said he'd be happy to handle it. Had a buyer already interested, in fact. Someone who'd pay cash, make it simple. We wouldn't have to deal with cleaning out the warehouse or any of that hassle. Just sign some papers, transfer the deed, and my mother would have the money in her account within a week. My mother looked at me, hopeful and uncertain. What did I think? I looked at Marc. His expression was open, helpful, everything a good husband should be. I asked how much. He named a figure. It was generous. Too generous for a warehouse full of junk in a half-abandoned industrial park. I said I'd need to think about it. My mother's face fell slightly. Marc's smile tightened just a fraction, there and gone. He said of course, no pressure. Just wanted us to know the option was there. Wanted to help. I thanked him. Complimented the salmon. Stayed for another hour, making conversation that meant nothing, watching Marc watch me. When I left, he walked me to my car. Said he hoped I'd consider the offer seriously. Said my mother had been through so much, deserved some financial security. Said he was only trying to take care of her. I said I knew. Said I appreciated it. He touched my shoulder briefly, a gesture that was supposed to be reassuring. His hand was cold even through my jacket. I drove home with my hand steady on the wheel and my mind racing. The buyer was fake. Had to be. Marc's employers, probably, or Marc himself using another identity. They wanted the property, wanted control of the warehouse, wanted to make sure no other records existed beyond what Marc had already found and photographed. They thought the fake documents were real. Thought they'd found what my father had been hiding. But they were being careful, tying up loose ends, making sure there was nothing else. Which meant they didn't know about the real records. Didn't know I'd copied everything. Didn't know I'd been watching. I'd bought myself time. Not much, but some. The question was what to do with it. I spent that night going through everything I'd collected. Marc's meetings, his lies, his patterns. The fake documents I'd created and the real ones I'd hidden. My father's letter. My mother's hopeful voice on the phone, asking what I thought about selling. I thought about going to her. Showing her who Marc really was. Proving it with photos, with timelines, with documentation she couldn't deny. But I knew my mother. Knew how she'd been after my father died, hollow, drifting, half alive. Knew how Marc had filled that emptiness. She'd been alone for 37 years in a marriage where my father had loved her but never quite let her in, never quite trusted her with the parts of himself he kept locked away. Marc had made her feel chosen, desired, important. If I took that away, if I showed her it had all been a lie, it wouldn't just hurt her. It would break something in her I wasn't sure could be repaired. And she might not believe me anyway. Might choose to believe Marc instead, because the alternative was too painful. I sat at my kitchen table until 3 a.m, turning it over, looking for another way. By the time the sun came up, I'd found one. I called Marc on Thursday afternoon. Said I'd thought about the offer. Said I'd talked to my mother. Would like to move forward with the sale. His relief was audible even over the phone. He said that was wonderful, he'd start the paperwork, have everything ready by early next week. I said there was just one thing. I'd been going through some of my father's old papers, not at the warehouse, just things he'd left at my apartment. Financial records, mostly. I'd found some discrepancies I didn't understand. Nothing major, probably just my father's disorganized record keeping, but I wanted to make sure everything was in order before we sold the property. There was a pause. Marc's voice was still warm, still helpful. What kind of discrepancies? I described some of the real information from my father's records. Not everything. Just enough. Just the surface. Things that would sound concerning to someone who didn't know the full context, but wouldn't reveal how much I actually knew. Marc asked if I still had those papers. I said yes. Said I'd been planning to throw them out, but now I wasn't sure. Maybe I should talk to an accountant, make sure there wasn't anything my mother needed to worry about tax-wise. Another pause. Marc said that was probably smart. Said he actually knew someone, a financial consultant, who could take a look. Would I be comfortable sharing the documents with him? I said maybe. Said I'd have to think about it. I could hear him calculating on the other end of the line, trying to decide how hard to push. He settled on casual. Said just let him know. No rush. But probably good to sort it out before the sale went through. I agreed. Said I'd be in touch. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something sharper, something that felt like my father's careful precision running through my veins. I'd just told Marc I had more documents. Had just made myself a problem that needed to be solved. He'd have to decide now how to handle me. Whether to try to buy the documents, or convince me to destroy them, or determine whether I actually understood what I had. He'd have to make a choice. And whatever choice he made would tell me exactly how dangerous he was, exactly who he was working for, exactly how far they were willing to go. I was turning myself into bait. Drawing them out. Making them show their hand. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was the opposite of everything I'd been my whole life. Small, careful, invisible. But I thought about my father's letter. About his trust. About the fact that he'd left this choice to me because he'd believed I could handle it. I thought about my mother, glowing under Marc's attention, rebuilding her life on a foundation of lies. And I thought about the warehouse full of truth that my father had spent 25 years preserving, because somewhere in all that silence and documentation and patient waiting, he'd believed it mattered. That truth mattered. That someone would eventually care enough to use it. I wasn't going to let Marc take the warehouse. Wasn't going to let him erase what my father had built. Wasn't going to let him keep using my mother. But I wasn't going to confront him either. Wasn't going to make a scene or file a police report or do any of the things someone braver might do. I was going to do what I'd always done. What my father had taught me. Watch. Document. Wait for exactly the right moment. And then, quietly, take everything away. Marc came to my apartment 3 days later. I'd been expecting it, but the knock on my door still sent adrenaline spiking through my chest. I checked the camera feed on my phone, another $70 purchase, installed above my door frame, and saw him standing in the hallway with a paper bag and 2 coffee cups. He was alone. I opened the door. He smiled, easy and apologetic. Said he'd been in the neighborhood. Thought he'd bring coffee. Hoped I didn't mind him dropping by. I let him in. Took the coffee he offered. Sat across from him at my small kitchen table and waited. He made small talk for 5 minutes. Asked about work, about whether I'd had a chance to look at those financial documents again. His tone was light. Interested but not pressing. I said I had. Said I was still confused about some of it. He nodded sympathetically. Said his friend, the financial consultant, would be happy to help. Really knowledgeable guy. Could probably clear everything up in an afternoon. I sipped my coffee. It was good, expensive, from the place downtown I couldn't usually afford. Marc had remembered I took it with cream. I said I wasn't sure I wanted to involve anyone else. It was family business, after all. Private. Marc leaned back slightly. His smile stayed in place but something flickered behind his eyes. He said he understood. Said privacy was important. But also said that sometimes an outside perspective helped. Sometimes these things were simpler than they looked. I met his gaze. Said maybe. The silence stretched. I let it. My father had taught me, without meaning to, that silence made people uncomfortable. Made them fill the space with more than they'd intended to say. Marc shifted in his chair. His voice dropped, became more confidential. He said he wanted to be honest with me. He cared about my mother. Cared about making sure she was taken care of. But he'd noticed I was protective of her. Noticed I might have some reservations about him. I said nothing. He continued. Said he knew it was hard. Someone new coming into the family after my father. Said he wasn't trying to replace him. Just trying to make my mother happy. I believed that last part was true. I thought Marc probably did make her happy. That might be the only genuine thing about him. I told him I appreciated that. Told him I could see she was happy. His shoulders relaxed slightly. Then I said I'd found something else in my father's papers. Something I didn't understand at all. About a warehouse, about shipments, about companies I'd never heard of. I watched his face. The mask stayed in place, but his jaw tightened. He asked what kind of thing. I described it vaguely. Said it looked like my father had been tracking something at work, maybe some kind of audit. Said there were dates and names and numbers that didn't make sense to me. Marc was very still. He asked if I'd mentioned it to anyone. I said no. Who would I mention it to? He nodded slowly. Said it was probably nothing. Company paperwork. My father had been meticulous about his job. Sometimes kept copies of things he didn't need to keep. I agreed. Said that sounded right. He asked where the papers were now. I gestured vaguely. Said somewhere in my apartment. I'd been organizing, hadn't finished. He stood then. Said he should let me get back to my day. Said if I found those papers, he'd be happy to take a look, just to make sure there was nothing my mother needed to worry about. I thanked him. Walked him to the door. Before he left, he turned back. His hand rested on the doorframe. His voice was gentle, concerned. He said he hoped I knew I could trust him. That he was family now. That if I ever needed help with anything at all, I could come to him. I said I knew. He left. I locked the door behind him and stood there for a long moment, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. Then I checked all 3 cameras I'd set up in my apartment. Motion activated, cloud uploading, recording everything. I hadn't drunk the coffee he'd brought. Had poured it down the sink the moment he'd turned his back. Paranoid, maybe. But my father had been careful for a reason. That night, I went to the warehouse and moved the real records. All of them. Loaded them into my car in the dark, drove them to a storage unit on the other side of town that I'd rented under my mother's maiden name. Stacked them carefully in climate-controlled safety and locked the door. The warehouse was empty now except for the fake documents and some genuinely useless junk. If Marc came back, if he brought people, if he tore the place apart looking for what he thought I'd found, he wouldn't find anything that mattered. Then I went home and sent an email. Not to the police. Not to the FBI. To a journalist. A woman who'd written a series about defense contractor fraud 3 years ago, won awards for it, built a reputation for protecting sources and seeing stories through. I didn't tell her everything. Just enough. Said I had documentation about procurement irregularities at a defense contractor. Said my father had been collecting it for decades. Said I needed to know if it was significant before I decided what to do with it. I attached 1 document. Not one of the most damning ones, but enough to prove I wasn't wasting her time. Then I waited. She responded 18 hours later. Asked if we could talk. Gave me a secure phone number. I called from a burner phone I'd bought with cash. Talked for 45 minutes. She asked careful questions. I gave careful answers. I didn't tell her about Marc. Didn't tell her about my mother. Just said my father had left these records, that I was trying to understand what they meant. She said she'd need to verify some things. Asked if I could send more documentation. Not all of it, just enough for her to confirm what she was looking at. I said I could. She said to be careful. Said if what I was describing was real, the people involved wouldn't want it exposed. Said I should consider getting somewhere safe, maybe talking to a lawyer. I thanked her. Said I'd think about it. When I hung up, I felt something shift. The situation was widening beyond Marc, beyond the small circle of my mother's kitchen and my father's warehouse. I was setting something in motion that I wouldn't be able to control. It was terrifying. It was also exactly what my father had wanted. What he'd been too afraid to do himself. Marc called the next morning. Asked if I'd had a chance to find those papers. Said he'd been thinking about what I'd mentioned. Maybe I should bring them by, let him take a look. I said I was still organizing. Would let him know when I found them. He said sure. No rush. But his voice was tight. 2 days later, my mother called. Asked if I could come to dinner Friday. Said Marc really wanted to talk to me about something. I said of course. Friday came. I drove to their house with my phone recording in my pocket and printouts of some of the fake documents in my bag. Not the originals. Copies of copies, enough to look like what I'd described but nothing that would actually lead anywhere. Marc answered the door. My mother was in the kitchen. The house smelled like roast chicken. We made it through appetizers before Marc brought it up. He said he'd been thinking about those documents I'd mentioned. About my father's work. Said he'd asked around, talked to some people who might know about the companies I'd described. My mother looked confused. Asked what documents. Marc smiled at her. Said just some old paperwork from my father's job. Nothing to worry about. But he thought it might be good to get a professional opinion. Make sure it wasn't anything that could cause problems later. I pulled the copies out of my bag. Set them on the table. Marc went very still. My mother picked one up, squinting at my father's handwriting. Asked what it was. I said I wasn't sure. Just records Dad had kept. Shipments, dates, companies. I'd been trying to figure out what it meant. Marc reached for them. His movements were controlled, but I saw his hand shake slightly. He looked through the pages. I watched his expression. Watched him recognize some of what he'd photographed at the warehouse. Watched him try to determine if this was everything or if there was more. My mother asked if it was important. Marc said probably not. Just company records. But he'd like to have his consultant friend look at them, just to be safe. I said I wasn't comfortable with that. These were Dad's private papers. Marc's smile tightened. He said he understood, but really, it would be better to make sure. For my mother's sake. I looked at my mother. She was watching Marc, not me. Trusting him to know what was best. Something cracked inside my chest. I said I'd think about it. But I wanted to do some more research first. Talk to some people myself. Marc asked what people. I said I wasn't sure yet. Maybe a lawyer. Maybe someone who knew about government contracts. The temperature in the room dropped. Marc set the papers down carefully. Said that might not be necessary. Said sometimes stirring things up caused more problems than it solved. Said my father had kept these records private for a reason. I said maybe. Or maybe he'd kept them because he didn't know what to do with them. Maybe he'd been waiting for someone else to make the decision. My mother interjected then, confused and worried. Asked what we were talking about. Asked if there was some kind of problem. Marc reassured her. Said no problem. Just being thorough. But he was looking at me. And I was looking back. The mask had slipped. Just slightly. Just enough for me to see the calculation behind it. The assessment of risk. The weighing of options. I stood up. Said I should go. Thanked them for dinner. Marc walked me to the door. In the hallway, out of my mother's sight, he stopped me. His hand on my arm, gentle but firm. He said we should talk. Just the two of us. Without worrying my mother unnecessarily. I said okay. He said tomorrow. Coffee. The place downtown. I agreed. He let go of my arm. Smiled. Said he was glad we could work this out reasonably. I drove home with my heart hammering and called the journalist from the burner phone. I told her everything. Marc, my mother, the warehouse, the fake documents, the meeting tomorrow. I told her I thought I was in over my head. Told her I didn't know what Marc would do. She listened. Then she said she'd made some calls. Verified some of what I'd sent her. The story was real. The implications were massive. But publishing would take time. Months. Probably. And I needed to be safe now. She gave me the number of a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower protection. Said to call him first thing in the morning. Said not to meet Marc alone. I said I had to. Said if I didn't, he'd know I was planning something. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said okay. But record everything. And send someone you trust the location. Make sure Marc knows someone knows where you are. I said I would. I didn't mention that there wasn't really anyone I trusted. That my life had been small enough that the only people in it were my mother and the man trying to manipulate us both. That night, I packed a bag. Passport, laptop, hard drive with all the files, cash. Put it in my car trunk. Wrote a letter to my mother explaining everything and left it in a sealed envelope with my building manager, with instructions to give it to her if I didn't pick it up by Monday. Then I went to meet Marc. The coffee shop was busy, Saturday morning crowd. Marc was already there, sitting at a corner table. He'd bought me a coffee. Cream, no sugar. I sat down. He started with appreciation. Said he was glad I was being reasonable about this. Said he knew this was complicated, but he wanted to help. I sipped the coffee. Said I was listening. He said he'd been thinking. Maybe the best thing would be to just get rid of those documents. They were old, probably irrelevant, and keeping them around could cause confusion. Unnecessary questions. Why put my mother through that stress? I asked what he meant by get rid of them. He said destroy them. Shred them. Let it go. I said I wasn't sure I could do that. They were my father's. Felt wrong to just throw them away. Marc leaned forward. His voice dropped, became more urgent. He said he was going to be honest with me. Really honest. He said he knew what those documents were. Knew what my father had been documenting. And he knew that if the wrong people found out those records existed, it could cause serious problems. For my mother. For me.